Rome is burning, not in flame, but in blood. The Republic, 5 centuries of tradition, law, and shared power, is tearing itself apart. Generals march legions against their own countrymen. The Senate, once the beating heart of Roman authority, has become a stage for assassination and betrayal. In the chaos, one name echoes across the Mediterranean: Julius Caesar, the man who dared to become king in all but name. And on the Ides of March, 44 years before the birth of Christ, 23 knife wounds end his reign forever. But empires are not built by the dead. They are built by those who survive them. Standing in the shadow of Caesar's corpse is an 18-year-old boy, slight, sickly, unknown to Rome's elite. His name is Gaius Octavius, and he has just learned he is Caesar's adopted son and heir. The greatest generals in Rome, Marcus Antonius, the charismatic warrior, and a senate full of Caesar's killers, look at this teenager and see nothing. They see a pawn, a placeholder, a footnote. They are about to make the deadliest miscalculation in history. Within months, Octavian, as he now calls himself, does the impossible. He raises an army, not through force, but through Caesar's name, Caesar's fortune, and a promise whispered to every battle-hardened veteran who once followed the dictator into Gaul: loyalty, vengeance, glory. The legions do not see a boy. They see their fallen commander's blood, demanding justice. And they march. Rome has no choice but to recognize him. The Senate, desperate to control the chaos, grants Octavian powers no teenager should ever hold. But he is not alone. Marc Antony controls the eastern legions. Marcus Lepidus commands the west. Together, the three form the Second Triumvirate, an alliance sealed not in trust, but in the cold calculus of survival. Their enemies are Caesar's assassins, the so-called liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius. 2 armies meet at Philippi in the mountains of Macedonia, and the old republic dies, screaming. The liberators fall. Their bodies are left unburied. Their ideals, liberty, senatorial rule, the dignity of Rome's ancient traditions are trampled beneath the boots of a new order. And Octavian learns his first lesson. In Rome, loyalty is currency, but currency can be devalued. For 10 years, the triumvirate holds, barely. Lepidus is sidelined, reduced to ceremonial irrelevance. But Antony is a problem. He controls Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the world, and he has taken Cleopatra as his consort. Not a wife, not a political arrangement, a partnership. Rome watches horrified as one of its greatest generals adopts Eastern customs, styles himself a living god, and whispers promises of a new capital, not on the Tiber, but on the Nile. Octavian sees the threat, not just to his power, but to Rome itself. He begins a campaign unlike any Rome has ever seen. Not a war of legions, but a war of perception. Propaganda floods the streets. Antony is no longer a Roman general. He is a traitor, a drunkard, a puppet of a foreign queen who seeks to enslave Rome. Cleopatra is not a monarch. She is a seductress, a witch, a danger to everything Rome holds sacred. Octavian does not conquer Antony with swords. He destroys him with words.
When the fleets finally meet at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, the battle is already won. Antony's forces, demoralized and divided, shatter. He and Cleopatra flee to Egypt. Within a year, both are dead. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, chooses the bite of an asp over Roman chains. Antony falls on his own sword, and Octavian, now 32 years old, stands unchallenged as the master of the Roman world. But he knows what happens to masters in Rome. They are murdered. So he does something extraordinary. He gives it all back. In 27 BC, Octavian appears before the Senate and announces his intention to restore the Republic. The provinces, the legions, the emergency powers granted during civil war, all of it returned to Senate control. He is, he says, simply a citizen, first among equals, nothing more. It is the greatest lie ever told. The Senate, overwhelmed with gratitude, does exactly what Octavian expects. They beg him to stay. They shower him with honors, with powers, with a new name, Augustus, the revered one. They grant him imperium, supreme military command over the provinces where legions are stationed. They give him Tributian authority, allowing him to veto any law, propose legislation, and present himself as the protector of the common people. He holds no crown, no throne, no title of king, but make no mistake, Augustus is emperor in everything but name. And Rome, exhausted from decades of war, accepts it. What follows is not conquest, but construction. Augustus understands that empires are not held by force alone. They are held by roads, by aqueducts, by the architecture of daily life. He transforms Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. Temples rise, forums gleam, public works employ thousands, and the message is clear. This is the new order. This is the peace that comes when one man rules. But peace requires control. Augustus reshapes the military, creating a professional, standing army loyal not to the Senate, but to the emperor. He establishes the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed in Rome itself, the sword at the throat of anyone who dares dissent. He reforms taxation, standardizes coinage, and extends Roman law into every corner of the Mediterranean. Provinces that once bled under corrupt governors now find stability, infrastructure, and the promise of Roman citizenship. The empire does not expand wildly under Augustus. It consolidates. It endures. Yet, for all his genius, Augustus cannot escape the one war he cannot win, the war against time. He has no son. His daughter, Julia, becomes a pawn in his desperate search for a successor. He marries her to his loyal general, Agrippa, who dies too soon. Then to his stepson, Tiberius, a brilliant but bitter commander who despises the role forced upon him. Augustus watches his chosen heirs die, one by one. His grandsons, his nephews, all victims of disease, conspiracy, or fate. The succession becomes a haunting, unresolved question. If the emperor is mortal, how does the empire survive him? In the end, Augustus does what he must. He names Tiberius his heir, not out of love, but necessity. And in 14 AD, at the age of 75, Augustus dies in the arms of his wife, Livia. His last words, according to legend, are a final performance. He asks those around him if he has played his part well in the comedy of life. Then he tells them to applaud. Rome does more than applaud. It deifies him. Augustus, once a sickly boy with no claim but a name, is declared a god.
Temples are raised, altars burn with incense. His image is carved into stone across 3 continents. And the system he built, this carefully disguised autocracy, wrapped in republican language, becomes the blueprint for every emperor who follows. For 2 centuries, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, holds. An empire stretching from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the mists of Britain, from the Rhine to the sands of Egypt, all bound by roads, laws, and the image of one man who understood power better than anyone before him. Augustus did not seize Rome, he seduced it. He made tyranny look like salvation. He made one-man rule feel like freedom restored. And in doing so, he changed the world.
Rome would have emperors for 1,000 years. Some would be monsters, some would be saints, but none would escape the shadow of the first. Augustus set the template. He proved that republics die not with a roar, but with a whisper. That people will surrender their liberty for the promise of order. That power, when wielded with patience and precision, does not need to announce itself. It simply becomes inevitable. This is how empires are born. Not in the fire of conquest, but in the cold calculation of a man who knew that the greatest victory is the one your enemy does not realize they have lost. Augustus did not destroy the Roman Republic. He transformed it. And in doing so, he ensured that his name would outlast kingdoms, outlast gods, outlast even Rome itself. The first emperor, the eternal example, the man who taught the world that power, once seized, need never be surrendered, so long as it is never called by its true name.